There, he came under the influence of Reverend Dr. A.M. Lamb, a white Presbyterian minister. Placing his aged hand on my head, he said to me, "It is the unseen hand of providence that saved you early this morning and brought me here, my son." In America, Azikiwe did every low job imaginable to pay his way, including sweeping, dishwashing, coal mining, and working as a road laborer and lift operator in between repeated bouts of unemployment. Despite all his hard work, he had to leave Howard University with his studies unfinished because he owed tuition fees. It was only after more toil and struggle that he was able to gain admission into Lincoln University to finally finish his first degree before enrolling at Columbia University to study journalism. Once again, though he ran out of money and had to drop out of Columbia, he returned to Lincoln, which gave him a teaching assistantship to pay for his studies. Finally, he returned to Columbia to enroll for a PhD in political science. It was the hard experience of his life in America which led him to the following admission in the preface to his autobiography. "Since attaining manhood, I have had to fend for myself in a world where idealism and materialism are usually opposed to each other. In the course of my life's odyssey, I have been convinced that I must be idealistic to justify my existence as a human being, but I must also be materialistic to adapt myself to the concatenations of a materialistic world. To steer between these two, it became necessary for me to be eclectic and pragmatic, to draw the best from each philosophy and make it work to my advantage in the light of reason and experience." From Azikiwe's varied life experiences, his upbringing in the north, west, and east of Nigeria, one might have expected that he would have become Pan-Africanist in political outlook and a one Nigerian man. The external influence, which turned him into a jingoist champion of Igbo ethnic group, lies at the heart of the Nigerian disaster story and tragedy which was to befall his people. So, Governor Bernard Bodilon. I will continue that, but I need a quick tea break. So I think we are like deeply in, and from what I have here, we still have like about 15 to 20 pages left. But I'll take a tea break. Okay. But the also don't tell. They don't take away our ancestors also. A lot of us are hustling. And today, we probably have no idea what the future holds for all of us now. Because if you take a look at it, the only difference is that those who were the educated natives before independence of Nigeria, their education and then their motivation for independence was came through their exposure when they became students in Europe, here, especially in Britain. They met other educated natives from the empire, the colonies of Britain, who came here to school. And they used that education, right, to kick off a movement that indeed changed the course of the histories of their countries. Today, Nigerians are using education just to run away from Nigeria. People are selling their properties just to get student visa because they want to escape from Nigeria. And when they finish with the education, they don't want to go back to that place. Do you see the contrast? So we have seen those of us who are now like in the diaspora too, politically conscious, completely against the status quo of what is happening in Nigeria. So we do not know what the future holds for us. You get what I mean? But yet, there is something for us in that future. So keep going. And that's why we need to educate a lot of us, so that when the destiny of millions of people falls on your laps, right? You would have been adequately educated, enlightened, to understand that, you see, it is just a call of responsibility. It is not an opportunity to further enslave them. With clarity and a better education historical like this, we expect that generations who knows the era of those men of the past, what they went through and what they achieved and what they failed to achieve, we could be writing or reading your own history in another 50 years' time. And yeah, it's because it's going to happen, right? Good. So let us now continue. Governor Bernard Bodilon. The high-level thinking on future colonial policy in Africa and on the future of the Nigerian colony in particular was underway even as World War II and the negotiations for African entry into the war were going on. Those tasked with the responsibility were Marjorie Peram and Bernard Bodilon. The former was Frederick Lugard's biographer. The latter was his disciple, whose influence on the internal political configuration of Nigeria was almost as great as the influence that Goldie and Lugard had on the country's external boundaries. To say that Bodilon walked in the footsteps of Lugard is no exaggeration. Like him, he had started his colonial service in India, where Lugard had first acquired his taste for indirect rule, before, like Lugard, moving to Uganda to take up his first governorship appointment. As Lugard had done in his own time, it was from Uganda that he arrived as governor of Nigeria in 1935 to take over from Cameroon. Lugard began the process of extending indirect rule to the south, but it was Bodilon who completed it. Under the system, the educated natives' political participation would be tempered by the influence of the traditional rulers, with the native authorities serving as a form of electoral college in selecting candidates for the representative assemblies. In both India and Sri Lanka, he had witnessed what the Lugardists considered to be the intoxication effects on the colonial subject of missionary education. His comments on education policy, which he first articulated while governor of Uganda, were straight out of the Lugard manual. He wrote, education, he argued, had to be built slowly and upon a secure foundation of primary teachings, biased towards agriculture, while too much secondary education was a positive menace. Purely academic teachings would not, in his opinion, help to produce national character, while a too rapid spread of higher education would overstock the employment market and yield a large crop of discontented, unemployables, who produce all sorts of political troubles and do no good to themselves or the country. Much better to concentrate on providing elementary education for all. He was, as his biographer depicted him, a 20th century colonialist. His thinking was in terms of how to strengthen and sustain the British Empire rather than how to bring it to an end. He believed that Britain would be ruling Nigeria for several more generations. And at the outset, his aim was to put in place a model of government that would secure Nigeria's position within the empire for the foreseeable future. Essentially, the plan was for a slow and protracted introduction of democratic practices to the south to keep the educated natives at bay whilst devising special arrangement for the North that would protect and preserve the feudal order and the pact with the Fulani. It was a race against time. At its core, it was simply the revival of the plan that had been aborted earlier, following Lugard's first departure in 1919. The mission was to perfect the unconsummated amalgamation of 1914 by creating a united Nigeria. Bodilon was determined to succeed where his mentor had failed in the endeavor to make the switch from direct to indirect rule in southern Nigeria. It was during the 1937-38 that, true to his policy of gradually improving what existed, he took the decision to introduce indirect rule in the colony area of Nigeria, the colony comprising Lagos itself and the districts rather, of Badagry, Epe, and Ikeja. This time, the unity was to be a unity of institutions. Method and policies are not simply a union in person of the governor. As a minimum, it meant a shared model of governance for North and South and a common education policy. In both respects, it was the practices prevailing in the North that were to be applied in the South and not vice versa. A battle of wits now ensued between the educated natives, determined to make it through to the promised land, and the defenders of the empire, equally determined to keep them out. In 1937, Marjorie Peram urged that officialdom persevere in the development and modernization of the native authority system, and that the educated elements be integrated into that system, but she cautioned against admitting them to the central superstructure or giving them any further powers in the Legislative Council. If there was any daylight to be found between Bodilon and Lugard, it was only in their method. While the latter, the soldier, had sought to achieve the policy objective by direct confrontation with the educated natives, Bodilon went about the same objective using more slippery art of diplomacy, earning great acclaim for the relationship that he cultivated in the process. His tactic was to make some concessions to the native contribution to the war effort in some of the constitutional reforms. Thus, whilst prior to the war, the policy had been one of complete exclusion of the educated natives from central and local governments. So, two educated Africans, Sir Adeyemo Alakija and Justice S.B. Rhodes, were appointed to the Governor's Executive Council in 1943, but both were considered by the nationalists to be safe government men. Before 1943, no African had participated directly in policy formulation at the central executive level. Furthermore, with few exceptions, Africans were excluded from the various functional councils and boards appointed by the government to advise on specific problems. While Lugard had sought to keep the troublesome elements at arm's length and to browbeat them, Bodilon drew them close. It was a masterful public relation exercise bordering on a confidence trick. He promised dialogue, actively courted their society, and provided material support at opportune moments to key players who were prepared to accept the offered hand. He is reported to have helped Azikiwe's publication, West African Pilots Secure New Offices, in February 1939, after it had been evicted from his Broad Street premises. So skillfully did Bodilon play this hand that he won the radical groups over completely. So in a mere 15 months, he had helped to lay secure foundations of goodwill and cooperation between the colonial authorities and the Nigerian youth movement, an organization which had become unquestionably the main focus of Nigerian nationalism when it achieved electoral success for the first time. Members of the NYM now sat on its legislative council, which they might have been expected to keep their distance from, and in 1937, he became a patron of the London-based West African Students' Union. On 29 October 1938, Bodilon was meeting with the NYM to talk about Hitler's demand for territory in Africa. His popularity amongst those who were supposed to be leading the battle against colonial governments, of which he was the first representative, was summed up in the following passage, in quote, "The NYM declared that Sir Bernard was a sportsman and a gentleman, and on the eve of his departure on leave on 19th May 1938, around 400 members held a torchlight procession to Government House to bid him farewell. An unprecedented event, not simply in Nigeria, but in the whole of British Africa. And it was around this time that the pork pie art, which the governor habitually wore, started to become remarkably popular. It was known and sold as the Bodilon. Nobody should be without one, ran the advertisement, and very soon nobody was. The fundamentals of Bodilon's covert scheme to keep the educated natives from power had been decided upon in 1937, although the implementation of the main planks only began in 1939, following Bodilon's publication of his memorandum on the future political development of Nigeria. Even though he avoided consulting with the educated natives on the proposals in the memorandum, he was not without opposition from those who he did not consult. Ironically, the most vociferous opponent of the proposal was a Briton, Theodore Samuel Adams, the chief commissioner for the northern provinces, 1936 to 1943, who had the reputation for being a rabid anti-Southerner, drawing upon his experiences in Malaya and the failed effort to fuse Chinese and Malay people into one community. Adams saw the two societies, North and South, as being too different to make any attempt to unify them, meaningful, let alone sustainable. Just as the differences between the colony of the Strait settlement and the Malay state has necessitated separate legislatures and local finance, the possibility of these different units coming more closely together is a possibility only and in one of the last stages in a remote development. For several generations in Nigeria too, one should look on the various parts as united in the governor and no other authority. But Bodilon had strategies to ensure that the Chinese domination of the Malays would not be replicated in Nigeria by Southern domination of Northerners. Promoting division in the South. While Yoruba and Fulani antipathy can be traced to the 1804 jihad of Uthman Danfodio, the difficulties between the Yoruba and the Igbo are of more recent genesis. Excuse me. As the two nations share no borders or pre-British colonial interaction, the enmity is entirely the product of the politics of the period between the build-up to the Second World War and independence in 1960. Its beginning can be pinpointed to the action taken by Governor Bodilon on the 1st April 1939, when he reserved the amalgamation of eastern and western provinces of Nigeria that had created one South and which had been in effect since 1906. The measure had not been precipitated by any agitation for the division from the people of the Southeast or Southwest. It was also devoid of any intrinsic logic, since the South was territorially smaller than the North, had fewer ethnic groups, and was almost wholly Christian. Despite the warm and constructive relationship he had with the Nigerian youth movement, involving dialogue and consultation over many issues, there is no evidence that Bodilon consulted them on this critical issue of reversal of the Southern amalgamation. They claim that Nigeria falls naturally into three regions: the North, the West, and the East, made by Bodilon's successor, Sir Arthur Richards, was pure sophistry, which contradicted every scholarly comment on record on the point. Emeo Awa, in his book, Federal Government in Nigeria, cites the writing of Lord Haley, Marjorie Perham, Lord Lugard, and Bernard Bodilon himself in evidence against the notion. The scheme of amalgamation by E.D. Morel, had proposed in 1911, saw a Nigeria of four regions: two in the north, the northern and the central province, and two in the south, the western and the eastern province. Bodilon's biographer, Robert D. Pierce, conscious of the charge that his man deliberately fractured an existing consensus in southern Nigeria, whilst leaving the north as one, makes an attempt to defend his man when he wrote, "To concentrate on Bodilon's decision not to divide the north in 1937 is to sensationalize the issue. His actions ought to be judged in relation to the needs of the time rather than unpredictable future consequences." The weakness in the argument is that the decision was to reflect upon the need of the southern Nigerians. More importantly, the future consequences of the omission to split the north in the same way, far from being unpredictable, were in fact known, and the move was drawn directly from British experience in India, which had been a British colony for much longer than Nigeria, and where the nationalist campaign for independence was much further advanced. So here is the Indian precedent. Give me a sec. I've got something to put up there, but I think I'll do that later. So India precedents. Just a moment. Right. Oh my. In India, as in Nigeria, there were two principal stakeholders, stakeholder groups rather, divided on religious lines. In India, it was the Hindus and the Muslims, while in Nigeria, it was the Christians and the Muslims. In keeping with the empire's general policy of keeping interference with Islamic ways to a minimum, Western education had been extended only to the Hindus, who consequently were at the vanguard of the agitation for independence, as with the Yoruba in Nigeria. It was the Hindus of Bengal, seat of the then capital of British India, Calcutta, who had been identified as the most vocal. In 1905, the British Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, had implemented a partition measure to divide and distract the chasing pack of Indian nationalists. So this was what Curzon wrote. As the largest, most populous, and most troublesome administrative unit in British India, Bengal posed a worthy challenge. With a population twice that of Great Britain, which was predominantly Hindu in the West and Muslim in the East, the administrative case for a division of the two brokered little argument. Curzon therefore pushed ahead. he was not unimpressed by the view that Bengal's highly vocal critics would also thereby be partitioned. Although the partition of Bengal was reversed in 1911, by then the damage had been done to the common front, which had been emerging between Muslims and Hindu nationalists against British rule. From this point on, Muslim nationalists who had worked side by side with Hindu nationalists within the Congress Party felt the need for a party of their own, separate from what was now being depicted and perceived as a Hindu-dominated Congress Party. Within 2 years of the partition in Bengal, the All India Muslim Conference was convened, which led to the creation of a political party by the same name. The separation was compounded by elections in India in 1937, in which the British introduced the concept of separate electorates and reserved seats to give maximum recognition to the now separate Islamic political voice in the Hindu-dominated country. Once such political identities are awakened in the struggle for power, they cannot be easily put to rest again. Though this process of imperial political engineering, the Congress Party, which had historically been the party of all Indians, of all communities, and transcending all religious differences, became the party of the Hindus. The Muslim League became the party of the Muslims. Bodilon, having started his colonial service in India in 1908, at a time when the effects of the 1905 Bengal partition were still unfolding, and having left in 1918, some years after the attempted reversal of the partition, would have had first-hand knowledge of the effect of such sectarian measures. It was this Machiavellian precedent from India, from British India, that was applied to Nigeria in 1939 to sow the seeds of division between the nationalists of southern Nigeria. The poisoning of the southern Niger. The new three-region structure was consolidated in the new constitution, which Governor Richards introduced in 1946. But the retreat to regionalism was only a measure to split the southern consensus. The end game remained a unified Nigeria. In fact, this measure represents not the division of one unit into three, but the beginning of the fusion of innumerable small units into three, and from this into one. The division of South having been implemented without consultation. Elections in 1946 and 1951 now served to crystallize the new divide, which had been introduced into the polity. The Nigerian youth movement was to the nationalists what the Indian National Congress had been to their counterparts in India. It had been intended as a secular organization for all Nigerians, regardless of ethnic and religious and linguistic differences. Just as the Congress Party in India had originally been the shared platform of the Muslim leader, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and the Hindu leaders, Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Nehru. So too, the NYM had boasted the heavyweight collective of Nnamdi Azikiwe, H.O. Davis, Obafemi Awolowo, and Anthony Enahoro. Having begun with so much promise, it suddenly died a complete death, with accusations and counter-accusations of tribalism. The allegation against Azikiwe, which led to him being summoned before the Central Executive Committee of the organization in October 1940 to explain why he should not be expelled, was that in his effort to galvanize and prepare his Igbo people for the post-colonial age that was dawning, he had overstepped the line of what was acceptable to the nationalist cause. But Dr. Azikiwe went about it in a manner which disgusted those of us who were used to describing citizens of Nigeria as Nigerians or Africans, and regarding their achievement as reflecting credit on Nigeria, indeed Africa, as a whole. The following are typical of titles of front page news item and editorial articles in the pilots. Igbo young man to sail to UK is the heading of a front page story and picture on September 23, 1938. The young man is Mr. Jaja Wachuku, now Speaker of Nigeria.